Welcome to the Vortex of Gemini, a portal of in-depth curiosity and endless possibilities. In each episode, I take you through a tunnel of emotions, sensations, and information. And in this tunnel, my intention is that not only our intellect, but all of our energy bodies are open to what we experience here. The mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual body. Try listening with all of them and see what gets activated within you. I'm your host. My name is Paulina, and I'm a 4/6 human design manifester ready to activate people. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my curious space that is this podcast, The Vortex of Gemini. I am so excited for today's episode. Today's guest, it's someone with a very special background. She's an intuitive astrologer, a psychologist, and a PhD student. And now also a podcast host herself. Her name is Frida. She lives in Sweden. And on Instagram, you might know her as Esoteric Adventures. In today's episode, we cover a lot of subjects, not only about having one foot in each field, but also what practices such as philosophy and astrology can bring to our lives. Ethics within unregulated practices, dualistic thinking, and much more, believe it or not. If you want to hear more from Frida after this episode, you can go and subscribe to her podcast on Spotify. The name is Child of the Night Podcast. And there you can dive deeper into astrology from her unique perspective. But now let's dive into the episode. Welcome, Frida at Esoteric Adventures on Instagram.
Hi, thank you so much, Paulina.
Thank you, and thank you for joining my curious space. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your background is?
Well, my name is Frida. I'm soon to be 34 years old in April. And I have a background as a clinical psychologist and astrologer. And I'm currently enrolled as a PhD student in psychology at Lund University. So I guess my thing and who I am is basically a very curious person with one foot in science and one foot beyond, in the esoteric, in the spiritual, in the realms of what we cannot really touch or see, but we can explore with our senses and feelings.
Right. And this background is one of the reasons why I actually wanted to have you on the podcast ever since I came up with the idea that I should have a podcast. I think it was last summer. So I wrote a list and you were in this list because of your interesting outlook. You contemplate a lot on your Instagram and stories and in Instagram lives. You also have some courses where you share your view on astrology and psychology and a lot of different things, actually. It's such a special background that you have one foot in the sort of mystic world, in the esoteric field, and one in the academic field. I'm really curious to know, can you describe to my listeners who don't quite understand what is the function and the use of astrology, and what is astrology?
Yeah, well, usually when somebody asks me to explain what astrology is, I often say that it's much more than just sun sign astrology or what we know about astrology in pop culture, so to speak. It's astrology is basically a really ancient cultural spiritual practice which humans have been involved with for thousands of years. And the whole idea behind astrology is basically that planets and celestial bodies around Earth tend to impact us in our existence here. And of course this has no like scientific proof behind it, or it's not like something that we can prove in that sense. But I say that to me astrology, because it's really a huge subject, it's so vast, there are so many different branches within astrology. I say that it's a way for me to, in modern days, practice something esoteric and also take part in 1,000 years old esoteric culture. Basically, you can learn so much about history and culture and human experiences and human practices through the art of astrology. So it's really not just what people think, that, oh, you read your zodiac sign, it's like fortune telling or something like that. No, it's way more for me.
Yeah, that's what I also feel like. Of course, when we first saw astrology, some of us read it in like these girly magazines, and it was the sun sign kind of predictive horoscope thing. Of course, that was exhilarating at the time, but once you start diving into what it actually is and the history of it, it's this whole new world that opens up if you're curious to it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I always also say to people to inform them a little that the sun sign astrology, what you're describing, actually was not so popular until the 1930s. So that's like a fairly new branch within astrology, because usually astrology was first and foremost practiced by people with a lot of education, like people who were back in the days, the scientists or the astronomers, the mathematicians, the philosophers, and even the priests, like those kind of people. Like in today's society, we tend to look down upon astrology and think that it's something that people practice just because they don't have anything else to turn to, so to speak. But it's really so much more than that. And I always try to say to people that it's also much more complicated and mind-boggling that you might think if you're only familiar with sun sign astrology. So I try to also, you can say, remind myself that for me as an academic or a psychologist, somebody who really stands with one foot inside and one foot beyond, considering the fact that history has mainly consisted of people like me, I'm not really an exception, there were people like me back in the days who practiced astrology. It's just that in modern days times, we are so used to having this division, between science and everything else. And that if you're a scientist in today's society, you should only practice the science. Science is basically the new religion. And I don't completely agree with that, because there's so much more that we can explore from like a cultural perspective, historical perspective, or just, basically to get a breath of different air in today's society, where everything is about, productivity. It's about knowing, does this work or not? We also need some magic in our lives. I think there's like a human need for that today.
Oh, yes, I definitely feel this. What would you say that someone who is curious about astrology but only knows the sun sign astrology, basically, what would you say they can use astrology for?
I was actually thinking about this today, speaking about contemplation and, philosophy. I was speaking to a friend, and we were basically discussing the whole, New Age movement and spirituality, where astrology oftentimes is, how can you say, it's like lies within the same kind of arena as those subjects.
Yeah.
And we were just saying that it's so sad to see that astrology becomes this tool to once again work only as a tool for personal development, if you know what I mean. Like, it's so easy to fall into that thinking that astrology is like a psychological tool to become better, stronger, develop yourself. But the way you can also think about astrology, if you try to look at it from like beyond capitalistic interest of growing, getting better, you could also just think about it as a pause. You get a break. I say to people, like, when I practice astrology, when I sit down with charts or when I read about astrology, it's a little bit like I would go out on my balcony and take a cigarette. It's like, that kind of break that people need. I don't smoke, and I don't like endorse smoking, but for me, it's kind of like the same thing. Astrology and practiced esoteric arts for me should be something to get, a pause from all these needs of constantly getting better, develop yourself, work on the body, be skinny, be healthy, work, get productive. No, because when you sit down with astrology or any other kind of divination or esoteric practice, you can actually do something that isn't productive in that sense, that is just reflection, or is just, diving into something that you find so interesting and on a deeper level, because traditionally also astrology hasn't really been accepted by society. So for me, it's also a little bit a way to revolt, you can say.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you practice something that is deep, you go into something else, and you just do it because it's so it just gives you joy, if you know what I mean. And that's why I think it's sad sometimes when people fall into the trap of only using astrology as a way to get better, or I need to become more enlightened, whatever. No, you can just practice it because it's interesting, it's fun, it gives you another perspective on life.
For sure. It's so interesting. This is basically really how I feel as well. For example, you know how you can use tarot cards or oracle cards. I really feel like this is a way to kind of zone out, just like you said, just relax the mind chatter a little bit and just like fall into the body, fall into the whatever feeling is more below the head. And I find it super relaxing. It doesn't mean that I take everything seriously that is before me, the cards that I lay down. Sometimes it's just the beautiful images, maybe a beautiful word or poem on the cards. And I think we need more of this beauty. And isn't contemplation actually, I mean, it can be mental. How would you put contemplation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know exactly how I would define it. I guess there would be more a generic explanation to that. But if I understand correctly where you're going, perhaps you're saying that we can also kind of connect more to the physical aspect of ourselves, like the body, and try to sense also, okay, what's happening within me.
Yes.
And I guess also, somehow that relates to what I was saying also about taking a cigarette on the balcony, because it's silly, but it makes sense also because we sometimes need to take a break. We need to step outside. We need to like pause, because many times when people do step out for a cigarette, they do that to either talk to somebody, be a bit social, or, to reflect upon something, or, just take that break. So I really, really agree to that. And I do that a lot myself because I love to walk in nature. I have dogs. And now when I'm currently on maternity leave, I walk a lot with my baby in the carriage. And perhaps I'm, walking, listening to some astrology podcast or something, and I walk in nature. I just let my thoughts wander. And I think that's really what what can benefit us today in today's society, where everything is so fast moving, and the spotlight is on productivity a lot.
I heard in your latest podcast episode, because you also have a podcast, we can talk about that later. In the latest episode, you talked about ethics, and I was really pleased to hear you talk about this because it is an issue when you go to, for example, an astrologer or a healer that doesn't operate from or doesn't know really ethics and the importance of an ethical practice.
Yeah, I do think there's a need for some sort of regulation because I mean, if you're a practicing psychologist, for example, or a medical doctor, you have a license issued by the state or something, by authorities, which you can lose if you do something unethical. And I mean, we tend to kind of need some sort of method to regulate who can practice and not in order to keep people safe. But I think, it's so tricky in the spiritual arena because you want to maintain the freedom as well, right? You want to like keep it a little bit rebellious, doing our things, witches stuff. But at the same time, there's the interest is growing. And with that, sadly enough, grows also the amount of people who are not serious and not equipped to lead or to guide or to counsel other people. And I've seen this very like first-handed. I've seen it happen a lot of times that people come to me, for example, and they tell me stories about what they've been told, and I've experienced it myself. And I just think it's something that we need to talk about more in society.
Yeah, it's interesting. I come from a background of Reiki healing, and my mentor, she was a nurse, so she has that kind of background, and she actually had a whole side course on ethics and how to meet patients, for example. She rewrote it to fit in this specific setting, and she's been practicing Reiki for I think since the 90s in Sweden. So she's like involved in how do you call it, a society or förening? What is that in?
Yeah, some sort of organization or something like that.
Right. And but sadly, I don't think that is the norm. It's just due to her background that she's teaching this.
It's also very difficult, because for me, for example, now I left the clinical work 2 years ago, and now I'm in research as a PhD student. Yeah, I have also met a lot of people, psychologists, who are really, really questioning why I'm into astrology, why I do what I do, why I try to speak about these things. But I try to phrase it as like, under the surface, there are so many people who are drawn to these subjects. They're interested, they're curious, even psychologists, medical doctors, nurses. We have all sorts of people who are interested in the esoteric. And, somebody also has to step forward and try to talk about the need of ethics because it's needed, And as a psychologist, we have a lot of training about how to deliver information, how to talk to people, how to be ethical. We also know when to refer a person to a doctor or a practicing clinical psychologist. We know those things because we're trained, just like a nurse, And so I think it's so sad that we're like canceling ourselves from those kind of, situations where we could be potentially helpful. But it's almost like if you're a psychologist today in Sweden and you're interested in something else than science, you're being, you're being looked down upon. And I used to just swallow that back in the days and just, pretend like, oh, I will not talk about this. But I really stopped with it because I am, I'm fed up with it. And I've had questions from practicing psychologists that have asked me, oh, I had this client today who asked me if I know a good medium. What should I answer? And I tell them, listen, you guys, you need to understand that there is a huge interest among people for these kind of things. Always has been, always will be. So we need to somehow be equipped to handle these questions. We're not supposed to treat people who have depression based on their astrological chart. We're not supposed to, say to people, oh, I can read your horoscope and I can cure cancer. No, but we have to find a middle way here. We have to understand that, like other countries, the Netherlands, Germany, there are people who, and America, there are a lot of people who are like PhD in psychology, medical doctor, and they're also astrologers, and it's totally fine. So
Yeah.
Sweden is quite behind on this, because there's like this division, extreme division between science, evidence-based practices, and other things.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even make sense, because in itself, you can even question evidence-based practices as of today. You can actually question if they're carried out the right way in today's structural, management, how it works in psychiatry. So there are so many things you could also criticize beyond astrology in the
Right.
system itself, but people choose to criticize only astrology mediums because that's what we're used to doing, I think.
Right. And why do you think that mediumship or astrology or whatever is in the other category, why do you think that they are so rejected? Is it because we are in their logic way of thinking, or is there something behind it?
Yeah, I think it's partly what you mentioned, and sometimes I also wonder, you can talk about so many different structures, like, what people are also mostly practicing today, these kind of subjects. We have witches, we have astrologers. I know a lot of male astrologers, by the way, but generally when you think about alternative subjects today in Sweden, you tend to, I think, connect that to women into some sense. And I've been wondering sometimes, like, is this like a patriarchal structure going on here or something, holding things down? Also thinking that these kind of practices, I mean, I saw a research article, I talked about this in my podcast, but there was a research article coming out where they state that if you believe in astrology, then you score higher on narcissistic traits, and you also score lower on intelligence. And for me, that's like really biased, and I try to move away from that, because there are scientists today that study something called PSI, or parapsychology. And it's basically the study about, paranormal experiences, out of body experiences, things that have to do with mediums and ayahuasca experience, all those kind of things, psychedelic experiences. And we have a researcher at Lund University who is studying these things. So it is today, it is a research subject. And, we're getting there. It's just that so many people are staying quiet and they're keeping themselves under the surface. And I have chosen, just like that researcher, his name is Etzel Cardenia, they choose to go forth with their interests about this, because it's part of what makes us human, I believe, to have a physical health, to have maybe emotional health, mental health, but also somehow, spiritual health. That's how I believe it should be incorporated.
Right. I think it's really, really nice that you do that, and that you actually, as cliche as it might sound, but follow your heart. I really believe that if everyone follows their heart path, then we're many people showing up to what kind of world we actually want to live in. I mean, I'm just thinking about myself. This podcast is one example of that. I was terrified of speaking from my heart in front of people, but there's this desire of just doing that. And here I am showing up, even if it's uncomfortable, but it's training that muscle. And I guess that also fulfills the spiritual side of me. It's joy eventually.
Yeah, definitely. And, that's why I also say that practicing astrology is also a way to be creative. And it's a way most people think that if you are into astrology, for example, then you are narrow-minded and you cannot think flexibly. But I claim the opposite, because if you work with astrology and you learn astrology, you know, astrology is about symbolism. It's about understanding and interpret symbols, symbolism, and archetypal energies also tied to that. And I think, you know, when you practice astrology, you must be able to think from different perspectives, because there's not one interpretation of, for example, a horoscope or an astrological placement, a planet, you know, whatever you want to interpret. There's not a one-way street ever. So you must be able to be flexible. Also, when you work with personal horoscopes, you can use the horoscope as a mirror to reflect and to think and to expand your mind. You can be like, oh, okay, Uranus in the first house. All right. Well, could be that I carry some rebellious energy in my personal expression. Could be that I'm a little bit chaotic. Could be that I like different kinds of clothing styles. And then you can try to reflect and open your mind. You can do the same with, you know, mundane events. Okay, we have financial crisis. Okay, could this be tied to these planets, you know, doing this in conjunction here? And, you know, it's really like, for me, also a practice that really draws on your intellectual ability as well, which people tend to forget. They think it's just, you know, oh, you're just sitting there making things up, you know, and it's like, you know, it's like hocus pocus. But no, like astrology is really like an intellectual practice. And that's why I love to connect with people who are into astrology as well, because you can really expand your mind so much, just like you do with philosophy or other subjects that you can discuss with others. You can really open your mind and open your way, the way that you think about things, so much through the language of astrology. And people tend to forget that, you know. And there is also, you know, this intuitive component, because I'm an intuitive astrologer. So I use a lot, you know, also the intuitive aspects of the practice. And that's also incorporated in astrology. But, you know, what is so important is to understand that it's not only that, it's a synergy between the mind, the logic, and what lies beyond our understanding, you know, the stars, what is out there, what you can feel, what you can sense. You pull them together, and that's, for me, what astrology is.
Right. You mentioned archetypal energy and symbols, and I mean, this is something that we see in historical books and pillars and in churches. Everywhere we see symbols and archetypal energies. They have been studied throughout history and molded, and they are understood as these primal energies that we all have inside of us in different kinds of ways. It's really interesting to contemplate on them and see, where do I have this, for example, warrior energy within me? I take that as an example because I didn't think that I had a warrior in me. But when I started contemplating on it, I actually noticed that actually I am quite rebellious in some aspects, and this rebellion could be seen as a warrior. And then how do I use this warrior energy or archetype within me? Do I overuse it? There's so many ways you can go.
Yeah.
And the same with the I guess the planets and their archetype, what they can stand for, the houses in the chart. You can expand so much.
Yeah, definitely you can. And that's why I also say that it includes so many different subjects, because the archetypes, you know, you can also connect them back to mythology, for example. You can learn about Greek mythology, Roman mythology. You can learn so much about subjects which are like tied, or like they're incorporated into astrology. If you choose to practice it that way, you can also practice it, you know, you can see the planets as deities or like gods, and you can also try to work with it that way. You can see it as psychological components within you. And with that understanding also comes the fact that, you know, contrary to what everybody says about astrology is for people who are self-centered, no, because if you look at a horoscope, you will see that the planets are represented in a horoscope, and all those planets are represented in each and every one of us. We all carry these kind of energies in different proportions, expressed in different ways. So that's also a way to understand that there's something more than me, something beyond me. In a society where we tend to become very, very self-centered and where, it's all about you. No, we are also similar. We are also the same kind of, we're made of the same things.
Yeah. I also recognize when you said the thing about the intellect, that we also see patterns. We see patterns in astrology. And what would you say to someone who hasn't explored astrology and now after listening to this, like, where could they start? I mean, it sounds like a huge topic now.
Well, I think just drawing back to the pattern here, what you said, I really want to just highlight that because that is a good way to explain what astrology is also, because astrology is also about recognizing patterns. And what do you need when you have to recognize patterns? Yes, you need logical thinking. You need to use your brain to see patterns. So again, to the critics who say that, oh, you're not smart if you practice astrology, I will prove you wrong.
Nice.
And about how to start with astrology, I think that it's very, very easy to get lost in a subject like astrology because it's so vast. And there, we have personal astrology, we have ancient astrology, we have the modern astrology, we have Western astrology, we have Eastern astrology, we have financial astrology, mundane astrology, relationship astrology. We have so much, so much. Oh, sorry. So many things within the subject of astrology. But I think a good way is to start by finding your birth time, if you're interested. Your birth time, the time you were born, the place you were born, and obviously the date and the year. And after that, you also need to go to a website or somewhere where you can punch in your data and retrieve your horoscope. And there you start with your sun sign, your moon sign, and the ascendant. Look at those 3 points and start to just read up on those 3. Limit yourself to those 3 things, because a lot of people know their sun sign, obviously, but not so many people know their moon sign. And by starting first with sun, then moon sign, by understanding that, you get a great, first introduction to what astrology can bring. But limit yourself there to begin with. And then keep yourself to the 4 components of astrology, which is planets, the energies in a horoscope, signs, how the energies express themselves, the houses, which is basically how we draw up the sky, around the earth. It's something abstract. It doesn't really exist out on the sky. The houses, which symbolizes, okay, what area, what life area, how does this energy, planet, in the sign, how it expresses itself, make an impact in my life? How does it come forth, and then lastly, the aspects, the relationships between the planets, the energies in your horoscope. Stay with those 4 components to begin with. Don't do anything else in the beginning. I would really say that because, like I say, it's so easy to get lost, and I like to get lost in things. I think it's fascinating, but I also have to say that, a lot of people might get tired of astrology before they even got anywhere because it's so huge, this subject. So I would say, well, what would you say about that?
I tend to soak up astrology and whatever knowledge comes my way in little bursts because my attention span isn't that great. And I guess it really depends on how you like to soak in information. But for me, I mean, I've been sort of not studying astrology, but reading a little bit here and there for many years. And that means that this knowledge is now, it's quite big, or like my understanding of what I feel astrology is quite big now. And do it in a fun way, in a way that you are inspired by. And I mean, Google is a good place, but is there something to be careful of when you Google things like...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think because there are so many different practices of astrology, there are also sometimes different schools, you can say. How do you interpret this or how do you interpret that? So I think you should have to understand from the beginning, what kind of astrology will I try to understand? Like, is it the Western type, which I practice, and also which house system? This is a little bit like, getting into this house system. How do we draw up the sky around the earth when we make a horoscope? How do we calculate how big the individual pie pieces should be? And I choose to go with the school that's called Placidus, which is also, it stems from, like I said, way, way, way back. But some people choose other methods to how they want to draw up the sky around the earth, making the horoscope look different depending on what system you choose. So be clear to begin with, I'm going to learn this method or that, and stick to that for a while when you try to get into it. I see actually a lot of those interpretations also, and that's why I say, okay, but it's about astrology, the logical component, because some people can also make up interpretations. And there again, we go back to the whole understanding that this is not regulated, this area. We don't know. They don't have a license to practice astrology. I don't even have a license to practice astrology, but I have a lot of many years of studying behind me, and I'm very much about trying to communicate what is I don't want to say real, but what has substance and what doesn't.
Right.
So it's important, find a good page. Astro.com is a really good page that you can trust. You can go on there and start there. It's a legit page. You can also take out your horoscope from astro.com. So yeah, that's basically what I would say. Buy a good astrology book, for example. Stephen Forrest, The Inner Sky. It's a really good book to begin with. I always recommend that to anybody interested in astrology, because it's really simple and it really goes through everything you need to know to start to interpret your horoscope. It's beautifully written also. It's very poetic in its language. So it's a really good book.
Your personal drive to expand and contemplate, do you use astrology a lot, or do you go outside of that when you think about things in a deeper way?
Very good question. And I would say that I try to keep a healthy balance here, because one thing is to practice astrology and, kind of let yourself be guided by that. But there's also a component where you need to make decisions for yourself based on what you feel or, what you want. And that's why I always go by the saying of astrology is the weather report, but you are the weather. Like, I am the weather. I need to remind myself of that, because it's so easy to get lost in a practice like astrology. And that's why, again, my psychological background helps me here, because it makes me question also. But I need to understand that the horoscope is a reflection. I can, for example, look at my horoscope and be like, oh, why am I constantly thinking about moving? Why? And then I see some explanation to that. And I draw up and I'm like, all right, I understand why. Okay, I try to reflect how I should deal with these thoughts or these urges, but at the end of the day, I don't ever let myself be limited by astrology. And that's the thing, because you cannot become fanatic. If you become fanatic with these practices, whether it's mediumship, whether it's believing in energy healing or tarot cards or oracle cards, you cannot draw an oracle card for every decision you have to make in life. That doesn't work that way. You need to feel and nurture your own agency and steer yourself, because you do have a free will. It's very important to mention that some people think that astrology is about understanding what's fated for you, what lies in your destiny. But to that question, you always have to highlight that everybody has a free will. At least that's what I believe. There's a free will. There are many different ways you can navigate in life, and there are multiple paths and outcomes, which might be similar if you look at the horoscope. But it's so important to not kill the own agency of people, because if you do that, I think that becomes unethical.
It always comes back to balance. Anything that you like a little bit too much, you kind of need to balance that out. There's so many examples of overdoing things. I mean, maybe you could even argue that being overly serious and only focused on facts and figures involves some thoughts and philosophy in there to soften things up.
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, isn't that what we were discussing in the beginning, where the system of care in Sweden today, it's basically like you're working at the production line, sadly enough. And that's also ultimately, where we need the balance. We need the balance. We need people, nurses, midwives, psychologists, doctors. They're also humans, and they also have a human experience. They need to be able to see other humans and meet them where they are, not just go simply always by the book. Okay, next. Okay, doing everything in that very instrumental way.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this also the other day, because I mean, I recently gave birth to my second child, and the same discussion you can just like what we're speaking about here today, astrology, esoteric and the scientific. The same discussions are evident in so many different areas in society. In the whole area of birthing, they talk about, okay, the hospitals are great, but it's very instrumental, it's very medicalized. It's almost like we are talking to women or making women believe that being pregnant is a disease. It's very medical perspective in the whole like in the birth paradigm in Sweden compared to other countries. But then we also have the other extreme, where people more and more are saying, I want a home birth. I want to birth in nature. I don't want to go to a midwife that's going to check my baby's heartbeat every week. We have those kind of movements. And I have really landed in, yeah, for example, Yoga Girl. It was a bit controversial. I don't know if you heard, but
Yeah.
Yoga Girl, a big yoga influencer, she wanted to have a free birth, and she doesn't want to go to the, midwife and that kind of traditional care. And for me, I just think that this shows us all that we need to find a middle way. We need balance, because you can have a physiological birth with the help of medical professionals. You can. And you can have the medicine and those kind of systems as a safety net, which is there to catch you in case the natural, so to speak, way doesn't work, because nature also sometimes has its challenges. Everything that is natural is not equal to safe. We have to remember that, because there are fungus in nature which are poisonous. There are snakes who are poisonous in nature. Everything is not safe when it's natural, but there's something that makes us as humans long for what is seen as natural more and more. And I just think, keeping the middle way here, understanding that you can have a natural birth at the hospital. I did that, for example. You can be a scientist and be interested in esoteric. You can work in the system as a doctor, and you can meet people and be humane at the same way. We just have to remind ourselves to not go to the extremes. It's almost sometimes like we are being pushed to the extremes. And it's so important to understand that the way we do different, the way we rebel, is by taking the middle way. It sounds so mind-boggling, but it's actually true.
It's true.
It's true, though.
The gray zone, I mean, it's so black and white nowadays, the dualistic, that people don't really pay attention to the gray zone or the middle ground at all. And it's interesting because I also think of it this way. I'm not a person with really strong opinions. I'm very much a gray zone person in general. So I've never understood this it's either this way or it's that way. Do you think that we will meet in the middle as a society in Sweden, for example?
I'm not sure. I think like the pendulum is going one way, and then as a counteraction, it goes the other way. But I think what people need to reflect upon in this process is objectivity, or trying to see things from different perspectives, like your psychological flexibility. Like we really need to exercise that more, and that for me is also equal to, you can talk in the spiritual world as being enlightened or all those kind of, yeah, I'm even tired sometimes of all those words, but it's so important to be able to lift your perspective, being a bit philosophical, trying to see things from different perspectives, argument for your cause. We might not be able to meet each other, but it's the discussion, it's the perspectives that we need. And in that process, we need to understand, like, if it doesn't hurt anybody to practice astrology, why would you be so against it? Why can you not hear the reasons to why somebody, for example, like me, would like to practice it? That's what I think it's all about, just trying to be a little bit open about it. It's like a tarot. I think about the tarot card now. I don't know how much you're into tarot. I recently learned about it, but it's temperance, I think it's called. It's a person standing with one foot on the ground and one foot in the water, mixing like a liquid between two cups. And it's also like a non-binary angel holding these cups. For me, that is the whole vision I have. Like, that's the image I draw to when I think about being able to move forth with things. You need to be able to flex between your own understanding of things and taking more of an objective perspective of the macro perspective. So important. People forget that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important messages. What if more people practiced that muscle? Thinking about, triggers, like we have a lot of triggers as society. And I actually sometimes follow people that trigger me on social media because I'm interested in knowing why it triggers me. And what I've found through this is that after a while, these people aren't triggering anymore because I realize that it's always inside of me. But I like to listen to things that aren't always necessarily true or that trigger me. And
yeah, I think it's important to expand yourself by doing that. What I've just reflected upon lately is just that in that process, we really need to nurture our discernment and critical thinking as well, because it's so easy just because, I mean, I think you're totally right. We need to expand ourselves by also facing some kind of resistance, or okay, this person doesn't agree with me, or I'm triggered, I have to find out why, and we deal with it. We go through with something like that. But it's also a fine line between following something or someone who you actually don't agree with deep down, and just doing it because you're oblivious, basically.
yeah,
You know what I
true.
mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
such a fine line. And again, that comes back to the whole ethical discussion, that this is because we do have people in these kind of communities that aren't aware of what kind of impact they might create by the things that they say. And so it's really a fine line there. And that's maybe why we just need more voices. We need the people that are the ascended masters, the gurus, to tell you something about yourself. We need that. But as a counter voice, we might also need somebody who says, okay, but did you think about this? Or did you think about that? That's maybe what I sometimes can miss in this spiritual community.
Yeah.
And the whole, like, in a perfect world, we would all internalize that. We will carry that within ourselves, right? And I'm sure you do, and I'm sure, like, I do. But, I just mean that there are, because of the health system, how it works, people are not being seen there, not taken care of always. They tend to divert into the spiritual arena, the spiritual communities, where there are lots of people standing and waiting for people to coach. And then they divert to there where they're being seen, and sometimes they lack discernment when they're in a vulnerable position or situation in their lives. And that's what I care about a lot, because I've been there myself. It's so easy to that you don't know how to navigate between these worlds, because you can't go to the healthcare practitioners and say, oh, I did some energy healing and that's why my test results are better, because they're going to laugh at you. And in the other world, many times the other world is like against traditional practices. So they're going to say, oh, don't listen to the doctors, they don't know anything, we're going to fix this with energy healing. So where is the integration? And it's so easy to get lost. So yeah, to make a now I went on too much maybe, but that's what happens when you spark my mind. It's just that I think this discussion is so interesting.
So gray zone, finding a middle ground, practicing zoning out to the macro, and practicing discernment. I mean, all of those are important to navigate this world that we're in.
Definitely. And I think a lot of people can also take help from just understanding that we're all human beings here, and that if you get into spiritual practices, let's say astrology, Reiki, it's so easy to get so enthusiastic about these things that you lose contact with your other friends, a little bit. I've been there, and that's why I also say to people, it's so good to have friends that are not at all interested in these things, because then you get the perspective, naturally.
Yeah.
I have some friends, you hear how we sit here now and talk, but I have some really close friends of mine who never, ever even thought about, what is this world made of? Why are we here? What is this whole human experience? They never questioned it. Yeah. They just go through life, they do what they have to do. They go to work, they take care of the kids, they don't question. And I find it so rewarding, to also spend time with them. Because I need to feed myself with their perspective as well. Again, that's why I say balance. Like, we need to remember that, and not get too lost. And we should space out, but we should also have some sort of reference point to get back to, That's what I try to do, This is my reference point. I go explore this, I go back. I go explore something else, I go back. I try to always find, somehow my way back to some kind of philosophical place, 0 point or whatever, so I can explore and contemplate and be, this, like you say, philosophical kind of person, because I think this is part of what I want to explore in my life.
I really want to talk about your project lastly, because you also have a podcast, and I was super thrilled when you announced it, because I really like when you talk about your perspectives. You have so much wisdom. It's called Child of the Night, and it's on Spotify, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a Child of the Night astrology podcast. And it's basically something I started doing recently. I'm on maternity leave. I cannot write so much now because I'm a little bit caught up. So I can do audio recordings where I don't have a script or anything. I just talk. Yeah. And but with this podcast, it's basically just a way for me to have an outlet where I can let out my thoughts. And if somebody likes it, like you, I appreciate it so much, what you say, and yeah, I'm just happy doing what I'm doing. Yeah. Because, and I talk basically about astrology, different viewpoints related to astrology, but also a little bit about the psychological perspectives and even philosophical perspectives tied to that, I think. Like, what should we use astrology for? Why? What are the, difficulties? Or I try to also really not just go with a theoretical astrology in that sense. I like to speak more broadly.
Yeah. So this is a really good suggestion for anyone who wants to expand their mind further with astrology, because Frida has this really interesting background and interesting different kinds of viewpoints.
I get so happy when you say this. You have no idea, because like I said, for so many years, I mean, I started in 2011 with astrology, and for so many years I just kept quiet because I was just, scared, and I thought, okay, people are just going to laugh at me when I speak about my interests. I shut myself down so many times, so I'm so glad that you give me this feedback.
In my experience, the people who are afraid to talk, that should talk.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, it's yeah, that might be true actually. Yeah.
Might not be true for everyone, but it's a common theme.
That's why I always think about also, the good things about social media, because sometimes social media can be really draining. But I always remind myself that, through my account on Instagram, Esoteric Adventures, I met you, I met other people who share similar interests, and I've really, grown to have so many good connections thanks to that, and people who really, I can exchange thoughts with, and I can, learn things from, and it's so amazing.
Yeah.
It's really the good side with social media, so I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah, same.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and there, but I guess we all need to remind ourselves, that social media also is, it's somewhere where people expect to be fed with very easily digestive, yeah, information. It's like you want quick stuff, and people are not necessarily, they don't necessarily have the patience to, learn about or think about more complex things. And that's basically why I also wanted to do a podcast, because in a podcast format, I feel like you can get closer to people, because for me, for example, I walk, with podcasts in my ears when I'm out in the forest, or when I do the dishes or I vacuum. So it's like, it's such a great way to connect with people, and you can also be a little bit deeper and create more of a conversation.
Exactly. That's exactly how I feel too. Frida, do you have anything you want to say before we close off this episode?
I just basically want to say that I love your take on your podcast, and I think it's really needed to have some sort of podcast that is more broad in that sense, about being curious about different subjects. So I really love that, and I'm so glad that I was invited to join. And I'm also so glad that I was invited despite the fact that I have my baby with me, because that's also something that I really want to, take a stand for, that women, we carry the babies. And we many times, we are supposed to work, we're supposed to be home, there's so many ways of how we're supposed to do things. And it's just about us deciding for ourselves what works for us. And I'm sitting here with my baby speaking about intellectual things and esoteric stuff with you, sharing a conversation, and I'm just happy that we have the room to do so. So that's what I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Frida.